James Harrison was a man of certainties. His entire life had been a constant climb to the top. Guided by numbers, strategy, and absolute control, there was no room for uncertainties, let alone belief in luck or destiny. He only trusted what could be planned, calculated, and executed with precision. His fortune wasn't inherited. It was built with intelligence and a cold pragmatism that made him see the world as a chessboard where only the sharpest players won. To James, life was a logical game, devoid of mysteries or miracles. But the universe does not care for logic. On a rainy night, while driving his luxury car down a busy avenue, the unexpected happened. Another vehicle appeared out of nowhere, its headlights slicing through the darkness like blinding blades. A deafening crash of twisting metal, shattered glass flying through the air like knives. The impact hurled him against the steering wheel. A searing pain exploded in his spine, and then silence. Everything around him dissolved into a heavy, relentless darkness. When he regained consciousness, he felt a different kind of cold. The hospital lights were too bright, and the smell of antiseptic made his stomach turn. The persistent beeping of the machine monitoring him seemed to mock his fragility. He tried to move, but something was wrong. He tried to move his legs. Nothing. His heart raced. He tried again, forcing every muscle in growing desperation, but there was no response. Panic came in cold waves. "What's happening?" His voice came out hoarse, tense, as his eyes searched desperately for answers. A doctor, in an impeccable white coat, with a restrained expression, approached, holding a clipboard. His tone was controlled, as if he were accustomed to delivering this kind of news. "Mr. Harrison, we need to talk about your condition." He paused briefly, then continued before James could interrupt. "The impact of the accident caused a severe spinal fracture. We did everything we could, but there was irreversible damage." James felt his stomach drop. The word irreversible hit him like a punch. "What does that mean?" He frowned, clinging to logic, searching for some explanation that could undo this. The doctor pressed his lips together and took a deep breath before responding. "It means you've lost movement in your legs. The injury compromised your spinal cord. The paralysis is permanent." James blinked several times, as if he had misheard. "No," his voice carried sheer disbelief. "That can't be right. There are surgeries, treatments. I can pay whatever it takes." The doctor remained firm, though there was a shadow of empathy in his eyes. "I know this is difficult to accept, Mr. Harrison, and there are therapies that can help you adapt, improve your quality of life, but medicine has its limits." James's fists clenched, and a deep anger began to bubble inside him. "Are you telling me I'll spend the rest of my life like this, stuck in this damned bed?" The doctor hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Yes." The answer felt like a life sentence. James's blood boiled, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He wanted to scream, to curse, to demand another opinion, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't change anything. When he was finally alone in the room, the silence felt even heavier. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the wheelchair beside the bed was an insult. He turned his gaze away, refusing to look at it. This couldn't be the end. It couldn't be. But no matter how much he tried to hold on to logic, onto any shred of hope, deep down, he felt like his life had ended right there. The man who once believed he controlled everything now couldn't even control his own body. And with each passing day, his resentment grew. He didn't believe in miracles, and he never would. The days dragged on, like endless shadows. James Harrison's routine was predictable, suffocating. Since the accident, his life had been reduced to a series of empty moments, waking up, staring at the white ceiling of his room, ignoring the phone calls that still insisted on coming, refusing visitors, and spending countless hours lost in bitter thoughts. But there was one thing he still did, something that, in a way, gave him the illusion of normalcy, going out to see the world that continued spinning without him. Even though he hated his condition, James insisted on going out alone. He didn't want help, didn't want pitying looks. That's why every morning he left his house and went to the city center. He would sit in a busy square, watching the cars go by, the people rushing past, the street vendors calling out to customers, everything that now felt so distant from his new reality. He was no longer one of them. Now, he was just a spectator. That morning, a cold wind cut through the streets. carrying the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the hurried voices of passers-by. James moved slowly, pushing the wheels of his chair with effort, as if every meter traveled was a cruel reminder of what he had lost. He was preparing to cross the street when he felt a tug on his arm. "Hey, mister." The voice was young, vibrant, full of an almost inconvenient energy. James turned his head and saw a boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, dressed in worn clothes, with eyes that seemed older than he was. His hair was messy, his skin rough, marked by a life on the streets. But what stood out the most was the confidence in his gaze. "Need some help?" the boy asked, but there was no pity in his voice. It was a straightforward question, without sympathy, without fake smiles. James frowned, suspicious. "I don't need help." The boy didn't back away. On the contrary, he smirked slightly, as if he were about to say something that would change everything. "I can make you walk again." The silence that followed was as dense as the morning cold. James blinked, certain he had misheard, but the boy stood firm, a nearly defiant sparkle in his eyes. "What?" Disbelief dripped from his voice, heavy with irony. "You heard me," the boy shrugged. "I can make you walk again." James laughed, a dry, cutting laugh devoid of any humor. He had heard this kind of talk before: charlatans, con artists, people looking to take advantage. He had seen it all. He was a practical man, a skeptic, and the last thing he wanted to hear was another empty promise. "And how exactly would you do that?" he asked, crossing his arms and narrowing his eyes. The boy wasn't intimidated. "There are things you don't understand, things that science can't explain." He smiled, as if enjoying James's reaction. "But if you let me show you, maybe you'll change your mind." James took a deep breath, feeling his irritation grow. "Listen, kid, miracles don't exist. Neither do cheap tricks. If you're trying to make money off some story like this, you're wasting your time with me." But the boy didn't seem the least bit bothered by the contempt in James's voice. He simply chuckled, a light, almost mocking laugh. "I don't want your money, Mr. Harrison." James froze. "How do you know my name?" "I know a lot of things." The boy winked. "I know you think your life is over, that there's nothing left for you beyond that chair. But I also know you're wrong." A shiver ran down James's spine. Something about the way the boy spoke, the certainty he carried, unsettled him. "Leave me alone." He pushed the wheels of his chair and moved forward, but the feeling that this encounter wasn't over stayed with him. Something told him that boy wasn't just another face in the crowd. James tried to ignore what had just happened. He tried to forget the street kid, his bold words, his gaze filled with an irritating certainty. But no matter how much he tried to move on and leave it behind, something inside him felt unsettled. He didn't believe in miracles he never had, and yet that boy had spoken with a conviction that left him uneasy. Hours later, sitting in his luxurious office with a glass of whiskey in hand, he still found himself replaying those words in his mind. "I can make you walk again." How could someone say that with such certainty? It was ridiculous, of course. Absurd. But at the same time, something in him couldn't simply dismiss the challenge hidden within that conversation. The next day, as if driven by a force he didn't understand, James returned to the same square. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the desire to confront the boy again and expose his deception. Maybe it was just curiosity. But there he was, and as if he had been waiting all along, the boy appeared, leaning against a lamp post, wearing that same self-assured smirk. "I knew you'd come back," James scoffed, impatient. "I didn't come back for you," the boy chuckled. "Of course not." The millionaire narrowed his eyes. "You always have an answer for everything, don't you? Only for the right questions." James took a deep breath. He didn't have time for this. But before he could simply leave, he felt his frustration rising. The audacity of this boy was infuriating. Who did he think he was? "Yesterday, you said you could make me walk again," James said, crossing his arms. "So prove it." The boy raised an eyebrow but didn't look surprised. "Miracles don't happen on demand. That's not how it works." "Oh, so now there are rules?" James scoffed. "How convenient." The boy didn't back down. "It's not about rules. It's about truth. You're used to controlling everything, Mr. Harrison, but some things happen when they're meant to." James hated that. He hated not being in control of the situation. He hated not having concrete answers. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, pushing the wheels of his chair, ready to leave. But before he could go, the boy stepped in front of him. "Give me a chance to show you what I know." "Just that." James narrowed his eyes. "And if I say no, then you can leave now and keep believing your life is over. Or you can listen to me and maybe discover that there's more beyond that chair." The silence between them was thick. James wanted to ignore him, to move on with his life without looking back. But deep down, a small part of him, a part he hated admitting existed, was curious. He let out a heavy sigh. "Fine. You have 5 minutes." The boy grinned. "I only need one." And without waiting for a response, he began to speak. James listened, unaware that in that moment, his life was about to change forever. James Harrison had never been a man who believed in the impossible. To him, the world was built on logic, on concrete facts, on an unchangeable order where only the strongest survived. But there he was, standing before a street kid, listening to a story that at any other moment he would have dismissed as pure fantasy. The boy, who James now knew was named Elijah, watched him closely, as if he could read his thoughts. There was no hesitation in his expression, no doubt. It was as if he had seen this moment before, as if he knew that despite James's skepticism, he would stay and listen. "You think I'm joking, don't you?" Elijah said, leaning against a graffiti-covered wall, arms crossed. "I think you're trying to scam me," James shot back bluntly. "Or maybe you're just another kid who grew up clinging to pretty stories to escape his own reality." Elijah smiled, but not in a childish way. There was something in that smile that unsettled James. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know a truth that others have yet to discover. "I was in a wheelchair too." James remained silent. "You don't believe me, do you?" Elijah tilted his head, studying the millionaire's reaction. "No." "Then listen." The boy took a step forward, his eyes now filled with an unexpected intensity. "I was 7 years old when I got hit by a car. I was playing in the street with some friends, and when I ran after a ball, I didn't see the car coming. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the sound of tires screeching on the asphalt and my mother screaming my name." James didn't react, but something inside him stirred. "I spent months in the hospital," Elijah continued. "The doctors said I would never walk again. They showed the scans, talked about the damage to my spine, the lack of hope. My mother cried, but even then, she refused to accept it." James clenched his fists. The story wasn't too different from his own, but there was one fundamental difference. He had accepted his fate. Elijah's mother hadn't. "She took me to a man," Elijah went on. "A healer," she called him. But he wasn't one of those frauds who take money from desperate people. He didn't want anything in return. He just looked at me and said, "You can walk again, but you have to believe it." James let out a bitter laugh. "And you actually believe that story?" Elijah shrugged. "I don't need to believe it. I'm living proof." The silence between them grew thick, almost suffocating. James didn't want to admit it, but something about the story made his mind race. Logic screamed that it was impossible. Medicine had been clear about his diagnosis. But what if? He shook his head, pushing the thought away. "You expect me to believe that some random healer made you walk again. I expect you to see it with your own eyes." Elijah crouched to James's level and spoke in a softer, firmer tone. "You have two choices, Mr. Harrison. You can keep hiding behind what the doctors told you and spend the rest of your life trapped in that chair. Or you can let me take you to him and maybe discover that there's more to this world than you think." James wanted to tell him to go away. He wanted to laugh, turn his back, and go on with his life as if this conversation had never happened. But something inside him wouldn't let him, something he couldn't understand. James Harrison was a man accustomed to challenges. His entire life had been built on calculated bets, meticulously planned decisions, and risks he could predict. But nothing he had ever faced compared to the insanity Elijah was now proposing. The boy wanted him to simply believe that a mysterious man, a healer with no credentials, could undo what science had declared irreversible. It was absurd. And yet, James was still there, listening. The idea that he could walk again was a cruel provocation, not because he believed it was possible, but because it made his mind wander, even if just for a second, to an alternate future. A future where he wasn't trapped in this damn chair, where he could stand up, walk, feel the ground beneath his feet again. But he refused to fall into that trap. He didn't believe in miracles, never had. You expect me to go to this man and just accept that he can heal me? James asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that it? Elijah held his gaze unwavering. I expect you to give me a chance to prove that I'm right. James chuckled, a short, empty laugh. This isn't a matter of opinion, kid. We're not debating whether the earth is round or not. This is impossible. Elijah smiled, but there was no mockery in his face. Who told you it was impossible? The silence between them thickened. James took a deep breath. He wanted to shut this down once and for all, to destroy the boy's absurd conviction and walk away from this nonsense. And then, as a businessman who always looked for ways to turn situations to his advantage, he saw a way out. All right, let's make a bet. Elijah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What kind of bet? James leaned forward slightly, looking directly into the boy's eyes. If this healer is real and proves that he can do the impossible, I'll make a donation. But not just any donation. I'll give so much money that your entire community will never have to beg on the streets again. Elijah's face remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. And if he's not real, if this turns out to be a scam, James continued, his voice full of challenge, you leave me alone. You never show up again trying to sell me this ridiculous fantasy. The boy stayed silent for a moment. James expected him to hesitate, to realize the nonsense he was spouting and back out. But then Elijah extended his hand. Deal. James hesitated. Something about the boy's unshakable confidence unsettled him. What the hell made him so certain? But in the end, it didn't matter. He raised his hand and shook Elijah's. The bet was sealed. Now, it was just a matter of seeing who was right. James Harrison never imagined he would find himself in a place like this. The idea of following Elijah to a mysterious healer was already absurd enough. But now, as he looked around, he felt like he had stepped into a completely different world. The community Elijah had brought him to was nothing like the high-end hospitals and state-of-the-art medical clinics James had frequented before the accident. There was nothing sterile or clinical about this place. Instead, it pulsed with a strange, almost unsettling vitality. Small houses made of wood and concrete, dirt roads, and everywhere he looked, people with hopeful eyes and peaceful smiles. It was as if everyone here knew something he didn't. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't belong here, but now he was here. Are you nervous? Elijah asked, walking beside him with his hands in his pockets, a faint smile on his lips. Nervous? James scoffed, pushing the wheels of his chair harder than necessary. I'm wasting my time. We'll see about that. James didn't reply. He kept his gaze fixed ahead as Elijah guided him toward a small building at the center of the community. As they moved forward, people watched them, some with curiosity, others with a strange familiarity, as if they already knew who he was before even being introduced. Who are these people? James asked, his voice laced with suspicion. People who've been through the same thing as you, Elijah replied. People who once believed there was no hope left. Before James could respond, an elderly woman approached them. Her eyes were sharp, filled with an energy that defied her old age. You're the man who doesn't believe in miracles, aren't you? James frowned. How do you know who I am? She smiled, a cryptic, knowing smile. We know many things here. James rolled his eyes. Great. Nah, more riddles. The woman didn't seem offended by his sarcasm. I didn't believe either, she said. I lost my sight years ago due to a degenerative disease. The doctors said there was nothing they could do. I accepted it. I lived in darkness until one day I didn't. James stiffened, an uneasy feeling creeping over him. Are you telling me you got your vision back? And I'm looking at you right now, aren't I? He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Her eyes were clear, full of life. Was it possible? No, it couldn't be. There had to be a logical explanation. Before he could ask another question, someone else approached, a middle-aged man with a strong build and a wide smile. The doctors gave up on me too, he said. Terminal cancer. They gave me 3 months to live. That was 5 years ago. James felt his blood boil. This is ridiculous, he said, his patience wearing thin. Nice stories, but nothing I can actually prove. But why do you need proof? Elijah asked. You're here. Isn't that enough to at least question what you think you know? James clenched his jaw, irritated. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to hear these stories, these impossible claims that went against everything he believed in. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't ignore what he was seeing in this place. The impossible felt real, and that was exactly what terrified him the most. James Harrison had never felt so out of place. Seated in his wheelchair at the center of a modest hall, he scanned the surroundings with growing skepticism. The room was lit by candles placed on small makeshift altars, and a faint aroma of burning herbs lingered in the air. Though simple, the environment carried a mystical aura. People gathered inside, some sitting on the floor, others leaning against the walls, all with expectant expressions, as if they already knew how this meeting would unfold. He hated it. He hated how they all seemed to believe so blindly in what they were about to witness. How could they be so naive? How could they actually think that a simple touch, a few whispered words, and blind faith could undo what medicine had already deemed irreversible? At the center of the room, a figure stepped forward. A lean man with graying hair and simple robes approached slowly. His eyes were serene, carrying the expression of someone who understood truths beyond comprehension. There was no arrogance in him, no theatricality, only a quiet confidence. "Mr. Harrison." His voice was soft yet filled with an undeniable authority. "You came seeking answers." James crossed his arms. "I came because I made a bet." The healer offered a slight smile. "And because, deep down, there is a part of you that wants to believe." James let out a bitter laugh. "You're mistaken. I don't believe in miracles." "Then why are you here?" Silence. James didn't want to admit that he himself didn't know the answer. The healer stepped closer and placed his hands on James's shoulders. The touch was light, yet it sent an unwanted shiver down his spine. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. He could feel the anticipation in the eyes of the crowd, the soft hush of held breaths. The healer closed his eyes and began to murmur words in a language James didn't recognize. His hands moved slowly, as if channeling some invisible energy. The air felt different. For a brief moment, James felt a strange warmth radiating through his spine. His heart pounded. No, he didn't want to feel anything. He didn't want to give these people the satisfaction of thinking they were right. The sensation lingered for a few seconds. Then nothing, no change, no transformation, no sudden recovery. He tried moving his legs, just to confirm what he already knew. Still immobile, the frustration erupted inside him like a fireball. "Enough." His voice cut through the silence like a blade. He shoved the healer's hands away and spun his wheelchair abruptly. "This is a joke." Elijah, who had been watching everything closely, took a step forward. "James, wait." "No," James snapped, his anger spilling over. "I knew this was a scam, but I still came. I still gave this a chance." "For what?" "To hear some pretty words and feel a useless warmth." The healer remained calm. "Not all miracles happen in the moment we expect." "How convenient, huh?" James spat, his frustration twisting into pure disdain. "There's always an excuse, always a vague explanation for why nothing actually changed." The murmur of the people around him grew louder. Some seemed disappointed, others just watched silently. But Elijah wouldn't look away. "James," he tried again, but James raised a hand to cut him off. "You lost the bet, kid. Now, leave me alone." And with those words, James spun his wheelchair and rolled out of the hall, his chest burning with rage. He had allowed himself a moment of hope, just a tiny glimpse, and now he felt like a fool. Miracles didn't exist, and he would never come back to this place. The night dragged on, heavy and suffocating. James Harrison lay in his darkened bedroom, staring at the ceiling as if it held the answers to the questions he refused to ask. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the distant ticking of a clock on the wall. But inside him, a storm raged. Ever since he left the community, he hadn't found peace. The anger still pulsed in his chest, burning like hot embers. He had let himself be vulnerable. He had listened. He had felt. And now he felt like an idiot. Miracles didn't exist, never had. He knew that. So why couldn't he stop thinking about it? Every word Elijah had spoken echoed in his mind, challenging everything he had always believed. The boy's unwavering confidence, the certainty in his eyes, the way he spoke as if he knew something that James still didn't understand. It infuriated him. He wanted to erase the entire experience from his memory, tear that chapter from his life like a wrong page in a perfectly written book. He closed his eyes and forced himself to sleep. But then he felt it. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, a faint pulsing in his feet. James's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. No. He lay still, trying to convince himself that it was nothing, a trick of the mind. But as the seconds passed, the sensation remained a strange tingling, weak but undeniable. He swallowed hard. This wasn't possible. He tried to ignore it, shutting his eyes again. It was just exhaustion, stress, maybe a random nerve reaction. But as the moments dragged on, the tingling grew stronger, like a weak current of electricity running through his feet. The air in the room felt heavier. His breathing turned uneven. Sweat formed at the back of his neck. Slowly, he lifted a trembling hand and let his fingers drift down to his foot, touching it lightly through the blanket. His skin was there solid, unchanged, but for the first time in years, he felt something. It wasn't strong. It wasn't full movement, but it was something. No, he whispered to himself, barely audible. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. The doctors had been clear. The medical reports were clear. His body was damaged, beyond repair. His fate was sealed. He tried to move his toes. He tried with everything he had. Nothing. They remained motionless, just as they always had. His mind screamed that the tingling was just a meaningless reflex, a false hope. But the doubt had already planted itself. James squeezed his eyes shut, as if he could erase the feeling, deny the reality of it. But he couldn't. The tingling was there, alive, and with it came something far worse than uncertainty, fear. Because if there was even the slightest chance, no matter how small, that something was happening, then everything he had believed in his entire life might be wrong. And that terrified him more than any medical diagnosis ever had. The sun had barely risen when James Harrison found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at his feet, as if they held the answer to a mystery he couldn't solve. The memory of the previous night still burned in his mind, the tingling, the unmistakable sensation of something awakening in his body that had long been lifeless. He couldn't ignore it. He had spent the entire night in a state of anxious alertness, trying to recreate the feeling, testing every muscle in his legs, without success. Logic told him it was nothing, a fluke, a meaningless nerve impulse, but something deeper, something he refused to name, clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, it meant something. He hated this uncertainty. He hated not having answers. But more than anything, he hated the fact that, despite all his efforts to deny it, he wanted to know more. And that's why, before he even realized it, he was back at that community. The journey there felt longer than before. The city around him continued as usual, indifferent to the internal war raging inside him. With each passing mile, his heart pounded faster, as if some part of him already knew that by returning to this place, there would be no turning back. When he finally arrived, he was met with looks of surprise and expectation. People who had seen him the day before seemed to already understand why he had returned. Some smiled, others simply watched, as if knowing this moment was important. He tried to ignore them. Elijah appeared soon after, his smirk intact, but without arrogance. "I knew you'd come back." James rolled his eyes. "I didn't come back for you." "Of course not." James let out an irritated sigh. "I felt something in my feet. I don't know what it was, and I don't know why I'm here, but I need to understand." Elijah nodded, gesturing for him to follow. The hall was the same, the candles, the scents, the silent, attentive people, but this time, something felt different. The healer reappeared, his expression calm, unsurprised, as if he had already known this moment would come. "Mr. Harrison," he gave a slight nod. "Are you ready?" James hesitated. The question felt larger than he expected. Was he ready? No, but he never would be. "Do what you have to do." The healer smiled and placed his hands over James's legs, closing his eyes. The entire hall held its breath. James didn't know what to expect. He tried to keep his mind rational, skeptical, but the moment those hands touched him, a deep warmth spread through his body. It wasn't subtle like the tingling from the night before. It was a surge, intense, pulsing, like fire coursing through his spine. He gasped, his chest rising and falling, his skin breaking into goosebumps. The sensation grew, spreading from his legs through his entire body. His fingers dug into the arms of the wheelchair, and then it happened, a movement. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. He saw it. He felt it. "My God," someone whispered in the crowd. James could barely breathe. His mind screamed that this was impossible, but his body didn't lie. The warmth intensified. His muscles, long dormant, shook. Elijah knelt beside him, eyes gleaming. "Come on, James." He looked at the boy, his heart hammering. I can't." "You can." Elijah's words carried an unshakable certainty. James felt pressure building in his chest, like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't name. He shut his eyes, drew in a deep breath, and then, with every ounce of strength he had left, he forced his body to move. His muscles burned. Every fiber in his being fought back. But after years of paralysis, his foot moved. The crowd gasped. Tears welled in his eyes. He wasn't sure if they were from pain, shock, or something greater. Elijah gripped his shoulder, voice firm. "Stand up, James." He hesitated. "I can't." "Yes, you can." The words echoed through him. James inhaled sharply. He braced himself against the arms of his wheelchair, and, with one final agonizing effort, he stood. The silence in the hall lasted only a second, but for James Harrison, it felt like an eternity. He was standing. His muscles trembled weak and unstable, struggling to support his own weight. His legs felt unfamiliar, as if they didn't belong to him, but they were holding him up. For the first time in years, he could feel the ground beneath his feet. The hall, the crowd, the flickering candlelight, everything blurred around him. There was only this moment. It was real, but his mind didn't know how to process it. He staggered, his knees buckling, and before he could collapse, hands caught him. Elijah, the boy's eyes shone with a quiet, knowing pride. "You did it," he whispered. James opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he explain this? His mind screamed for logic, for a rational explanation, but there was none. There was only the overwhelming, undeniable truth. He had walked. The healer stood nearby, watching with a serene expression. "You were always capable of walking, James," he said softly. "What kept you from it was something much greater than paralysis." At first, James didn't understand, but deep inside, he felt it. The tears came before he could stop them. He tried to turn away, to hide his face, but Elijah gripped his shoulders, steadying him. For the first time in years, James wasn't angry. He was grateful. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. A new purpose was born. In the days that followed, James refused to leave the community. He needed to understand, to listen, to see the people whose lives had been changed. He heard stories that shattered his beliefs. He met people who had been given up on, people who had once believed, just like him, that their lives were over. And for the first time, he realized how blind he had been. He, a man who had once controlled everything, had spent his whole life ignoring the most important thing of all, hope. His days became a test of strength. His legs were weak, his muscles struggling to remember how to move. Every step was painful, but every step mattered. It was a battle, but it was a battle he wanted to fight. Then, one day, he made a decision. He couldn't just walk away from this, not after everything he had seen, not after everything he had become. When he finally returned to his mansion, nothing felt the same. The luxury, the cold, lifeless walls, the silence, it all felt empty. And there, sitting alone in his vast, hollow home, he knew what he had to do. Within a week, James Harrison changed everything. He gathered his team of lawyers, consultants, and financial advisors. His fortune, which had once only served to make him richer, would now serve a greater purpose. First, he donated a massive sum to the community that had changed him, ensuring they had homes, medical care, and resources to keep helping others. But even that wasn't enough. James wanted to give hope to those who, like him, had once believed they had nothing left. And so, the Harrison Center for Rehabilitation and Hope was born, a place where people with physical disabilities could receive treatment, physical therapy, psychological support, and, above all, the chance to believe again. He built it next to the community that had saved him, as a symbol of what was possible when people believed. And in the middle of all of it was Elijah. James couldn't let him go. The boy had changed his life, and somehow, James knew that what had happened between them was no accident. There was something greater, connecting them. On the night of the center's grand opening, James approached Elijah. The boy was watching from a distance, his usual smirk in place, but his eyes held something else, a sadness, a farewell. "What's wrong?" James asked. Elijah shrugged. "I think my job here is done." "You found what you were looking for." James frowned. "Where are you planning to go?" Elijah gave a small, uncertain smile. "I've always lived on the streets. I'll go wherever the wind takes me." James was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No." Elijah looked at him, confused. "What? You're not going anywhere. You have a home now." The boy's eyes widened. "James, I never wanted a son. Never thought I'd have a family." James let out a breath, crossing his arms. "But it looks like the universe enjoys proving me wrong." For the first time, Elijah's cocky confidence broke. He looked vulnerable. "Are you saying you're adopting me?" James smirked. "I'm saying I'm not letting you disappear. You belong here. You belong with me." Elijah didn't answer at first. Then, suddenly, he hugged him. For a second, James froze. Then, slowly, he returned the embrace. And in that moment he understood. The real miracle wasn't walking again. It was learning to live again.